And we're back. What's up everyone? I'm Nick. In this video we're going to talk about grids. And just like they sound, it is an easy way to put a grid of items onto the screen. So if we think about like Instagram, on your Instagram profile at the bottom is a grid of images. There are 3 images across and then a bunch of rows of images. Well, we can add that in SwiftUI with just a couple lines of code using these handy grid components. Now, grids are fairly new to SwiftUI and they're not totally straightforward on how to implement and customize them, so I think they are often overlooked or underutilized by new developers. And that's why I wanted to take this video to really dive into how the grids work and how we can customize and format them to get exactly what we want. So we're going to dive into how we can really customize these grids. We're going to look at all of the different ways that we can customize rows and columns to make them adaptable or even dynamic so that they look different and appear different on different devices and they can have different layouts when we want them to. And one thing you're going to notice, at least at the time of making this video, is that all grids in SwiftUI are lazy by default. And this is super helpful to us as developers because what it means is basically if there are thousands and thousands of items in our grid, only the items that are on the screen or are coming onto the screen are going to be created behind the scenes. So this really helps us because if it wasn't lazy, all thousands of those items would be created at one time and it would really slow down our app. So the fact that these grids are lazy by default is very helpful to us. And even though these grids are lazy, I know that me and you are not. So with all that said, let's get coding. We are back again in the Xcode project. And let's create a new file for the code in this video. Right-click the navigator, new file, SwiftUI view. And we're talking about grids, so this will be a grid bootcamp. Press create, and once you have it, let's go ahead and click resume on the canvas to make sure we're all set up and connected. Now, grids are not as common as scroll views and HStacks and some of the other stuff that we've done so far in this course, but they're usually used with for each statements and in scroll views, and those are 2 things we very recently covered in previous videos, so I wanted to throw in this grid video quickly while it's fresh on our minds. So a grid is exactly what you think it is. It's just like an HStack or a VStack, except instead of just going in one direction, it's a whole grid, so it has rows and columns. So let's get started by deleting this text here, and we're going to add a grid. Now, almost always in this course, I type in directly here what kind of components we're going to add, but I want to remind you guys that you can always use the library, which is that plus button in the top right corner. And then you can search for, on the Components tab, you can search for whatever you want. So if you wanted to add a text, you could find a text here. And in this case, if we type in grid, we can see that there is a LazyHGrid and a LazyVGrid. And for our purposes, we're going to use the LazyVGrid. I think this is the more common grid. And I want to point out here that grids are automatically lazy. In the last video, we briefly talked about lazy HStacks, lazy VStacks, and all it means is that when you have a lot of data and some of the data extends off of the screen, this data will not actually load, this view will not actually create these cells until they are coming onto the screen. And that makes our app a little more efficient, that makes the UI a little better, so this is a very good thing and it's super convenient that grids are automatically lazy. Now, when we declare a LazyVGrid, it is asking us for columns. And if I hold the option button and click on LazyVGrid, we can read some more information about how to initialize this. And you'll notice down here that the columns are actually an array of grid item. So let's create the columns now. Let's do let columns, and it will be of type array of grid item. We'll set this equal to an array by opening the brackets and hit enter. And in this array, let's start adding our grid items. Now, we haven't used grid items before. Basically, it is just a little data point to tell the grid how big we want the columns to be. So let's call grid item. and open the parentheses, and there are two completions here. There's one with spacing and alignment. Let's use that one. First, it's going to ask us for the size, and there are three options: adaptive, fixed, and flexible. Let's start with the fixed one because it's the most obvious. And then it's going to ask us what size we want the grid item to be fixed to. So if these are columns, it's basically asking us how big, how wide do we want the columns to be. So let's start with maybe 50, nice and small. For spacing, we'll keep this as nil. And for alignment, we'll also keep this as nil. So we didn't really need to put the spacing or alignment into this grid item, but I want to leave it there just so you know we can change that in the future. Now, if I put this columns into our LazyVGrid, and I resume the canvas, you'll notice that there is only one column, and both of our text placeholders are being limited to that 50 width of that column. So I'm going to change these texts to rectangles because it'll be a little easier to see. So let's delete that, and I'm going to copy this rectangle and paste it maybe 5 or 6 times. So you can see here we have one grid item in this array, and it has a fixed size of 50. And because of that, in our grid, we have one column, and each one is 50 in width. Now, if I wanted to add 2 columns to this grid, all I need to do is create 2 items in this array. So I'll do grid item, I'll copy this, put a comma after it, and then I'll go to the next item, and we'll do one more. And now when we resume the canvas, you'll see that it automatically updated to a nice grid with 2 columns. And we can do more. We can add another column. Make sure you put a comma after it, another column. Now I have, I think, 5 columns. If I click resume on the canvas, you'll see how it automatically updates, which is awesome. So let's take this a little further, and instead of just having rectangle a bunch of times, let's add a for each loop into this LazyVGrid. So we'll do for each, and we'll use the data with a range. We'll do 0 ... less than 50, so 50 loops. Press enter on the content, and we'll change this to index. And then in here, we'll put a rectangle. And we'll give this rectangle a frame with a height of maybe 50. So these items are limited in width by the columns, which are fixed to 50 width. And then each rectangle also has a frame of 50. So now we can see a nice grid on our screen. Now let's customize this grid a little bit. So let's say maybe I wanted that center row to be a little bit bigger. I could just change this grid item to be fixed instead of 50. Let's do 100. Let's click resume on the canvas, and you'll see now every third column has the bigger width. So this is super handy when we have grids and you want to display different objects with different sizes. Let's maybe make this one 75 and this one 75. I think that could be a pretty cool design. And you can just see how you can get pretty creative with this. Now, while we're here, I want to also show you some of the other grid items. Instead of just fixed, we can do other layouts. So let's start by deleting all of these columns. So we're back to our one column that's fixed in 50 in width. And now instead of .fixed, let's call .flexible. And when we call flexible, it asks us for a minimum and a maximum amount. But for our purposes, I don't really care what the min or max are, so I'm just going to delete these inputs. So we have just .flexible. And let's resume here. So now when we only have one column and we keep it as flexible, it's going to resize that column to fit basically the screen or whatever frame we're in. So right now, the frame is the size of the screen, and they're being flexible and they're growing basically to fit the size of the screen. Now, if I added 2 of these, so if I copy this and paste it in here, you'll see that because they're flexible, they will automatically resize to adjust so that we have our 2 columns. This is probably the most common of the grid items, and I could paste one again. I could paste it, I'll do it 5 times. So we can see now that without changing basically any hard numbers, the grid items have adapted perfectly to fit 5 across. So I've seen this flexible a lot when making grids because everyone has different phone sizes. Sometimes you're on an iPad, sometimes you're on an iPhone, and flexible really just helps us resize whatever size we need. Now the last grid size that I want to show you guys is called .adaptive. So instead of flexible, we will use .adapted, and people rave about this online. I've never actually used adaptive in an app, but I feel like I personally find that flexible is much more usable in apps. But let's get started. If we call .adaptive, it's going to ask us for a minimum and a maximum size. And I'm going to zoom out here just to keep the code on one line. And for adaptive, I think we do need to put in a minimum and maybe not a maximum, but let's put in a minimum of 50 and a maximum of 300 again. And let's hit resume on the canvas and see what it looks like. That probably doesn't look exactly what you expect. And what happens in an adaptive column, basically this whole thing is one column right now. And it is adapting all of the items inside that column to fit as many as possible within these criteria. So as long as the minimum is at least 50 and the maximum is less than 300, it's going to put as many items as it can in that column. So it's a little confusing, but right now we have one adaptive column and it appears like this. And if we had 2 adaptive columns, so when we add this second column, basically the 3 cells on the left are in the first column and the 3 cells on the right are in the second column, and then they're adapting to fit as many as possible. Now if we change that second column, so the 3 cells on the right, to have a minimum of 150, it's going to try to fit as many cells into that column as long as they are at least 150 each. And you'll see now that we have the 3 on the left column, which have a minimum of 50, so we can fit 3, and only 1 on the right column because it has a minimum of 150 and we can only fit 1. Now if we change the minimum on the first column maybe to 10, you can see how we can get some pretty cool layouts. However, I've never actually used this layout. Usually I think the fixed or the flexible is much more common, but I wanted to show you guys that that is there if you wanted to do something like that. And before we wrap up this video, I want to just give you one real-world example of when we could use a grid. So let's delete the second column. Let's change the grid item back to flexible, because that's my favorite. Delete the minimum and maximum. And let's give this 3 columns. Click resume on the canvas. Let's put this LazyVGrid into a scroll view. So we'll do scroll view. Open the brackets, put the LazyVGrid inside. And let's change the height on these to maybe 150. And above the grid, let's add a rectangle with a fill color.white. Let's give this rectangle a height, a frame with a height. Let's actually make it 400. And what does this screen look like to you? Well, this is the template for basically an Instagram profile. You could put the profile section up here where we have this white rectangle, and then you can have all of the images for each person down here. And you could then scroll, of course, through the images because we're in a scroll view. And because we're using this flexible layout, these images are fitted perfectly 3 across. So this is an awesome real-world example. And before we go, I want to show you guys a couple quick advanced tips for these grids. So I'm going to delete this rectangle. I'm going to keep in the scroll view, but I'm going to add another LazyVGrid. And let's open the parentheses, and this time we have 2 completions. So the first one was just columns and content. That's what we used at the beginning of this video. Just have columns here. But if we use the other one, we also have the option for alignment, spacing, and pinned views. So let's press enter before each of these parameters to keep this nice and neat and readable. Before pin views and content. And I'm going to take our for each statement, I'm going to cut it from our grid and place it instead of these placeholders as the content in this grid. We can then delete this first grid. And for these columns, instead of having this array of grid item, which we could have just typed in directly, we're going to reference this columns up here. So let's put our columns in. We'll keep this center, our spacing as nil, and pin views will be empty for now. And the first thing I want to show you guys is that for the spacing, we can change it. So by default, just like in our padding, it has default spacing. It's not actually 0. And if we change our spacing to 0, it's going to change the default spacing between each row to 0. So you can see here that we lost the difference between each row, and it just looks like 3 columns. But let's put the spacing at 1, so it's 1. So you can see the little tiny spacing there in between each of these rows. We can change this to 50 or 50 to get big spacing between each rows. But for now, let's just set it back down to 6. And then we also can change the spacing between each column, and that's in the grid item. So if we had spacing of 0, and click for zoom on the preview, the spacing between the first and the second item have 0 spacing, and we can do that for the second one as well as the third one. And now we'll see that there are no spaces between each of these. Let's put this back to 6, so it's the same size as our row spacing. Hit resume, and now we have nice even spacing distributed out across our grid. And now I want to show you that we can use sections in our grid. So right now we have a for each with 50, and it is just directly in the content, but we could put this within a section. So let's call here section. It's literally called section, and our section can have a header and a footer. I'm just going to use header for now because it's more common. And we need to tell it what our header is. So for now, let's just add a text saying section 1. And then for the content, we'll hit enter, and we'll put our for each statement into this section. We don't need 50 items. Let's just go down to maybe 20 and hit resume. And you'll see here now that we have this section at the top. And we can customize what we want the header to be. So I'm going to put it on its own row, this text here. So I'm going to press enter before this text and after the text ends, but before the closing parentheses. And then I'm going to edit this header here. So let's give it a dot background of color dot blue. Let's give it a font of title. Let's give it a foreground color of white, and let's set a frame before the background. We'll do dot frame max width of infinity, so it's as big as possible, and we'll align it to the leading edge. Finally, let's add some padding around it. So now we have our section 1 title, and when we scroll, you'll see that it scrolls with the content. And this could come in handy for like certain lists and things where you wanted to add a section, like these were, maybe this was the first section of fruits, and then later you could have a section of vegetables. So let's add below this another section. Let's copy this section, paste down here, so we have another section. This will be section 2. I will make the background on that one red, and then I'm going to fill those rectangles. We'll do dot fill with color dot green. So we have 2 sections, section 1, section 2. And when I scroll down, we can see that at the bottom of the grid, we actually have another section where we start section 2. So this is super useful. And so now that we have our 2 sections here, let's add that rectangle back to the top. I probably shouldn't have deleted it earlier. So let's do rectangle. Let's fill it with a color dot orange. And let's set the frame with a height of 400 here. So we have maybe our header section, and then we have section 1 where we have a bunch of pictures or whatever you want to put. And then we have section 2 with a bunch of pictures, whatever you want to put. And you'll notice that the section titles scroll with the grid. And that's the default setting. What's really cool in these grids is that in our pinned views, we can pin the header. So in this pinned views, we have an array of what we want to pin. And if I press the period button, it gives us a completion. There are 2 variables that we can do, section headers or section footers. And we don't have footers, we only have headers. So let's pin the headers. And now when we resume our preview here, these section headers are going to pin to the top when we're in that section. So if we scroll, we'll get this really cool effect where the header is pinned to the top. And you can see that it's pinned for as long as we are in section 1. So when I get to section 2, it's now going to switch to the next section. Now obviously this doesn't look very professional with these colors and these squares, but this could come in handy and is pretty often used in apps. And this video is getting pretty long, so I'm not going to cover LazyHGrids. Basically they work the same way as LazyVGrids, except instead of going vertically, they go horizontally. And to do that, all you need to do is change to LazyHGrid, add rows instead of columns, and probably make the scroll view scroll horizontally instead of vertically. But that's it for this video, and now you know how to use grids, how to use all different types of columns, how to fix the spacing, how to pin the section headers, and how to use sections in your grid. So hope you enjoyed this video, hope you guys learned something. Hit the subscribe button if you want to stay updated, and as always, I'm Nick, this is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.